Christos anesti ek nekron thanaton patisas και της μνήμασι ζωή χαρισάμενος.
Christos anesti.
Αληθώς ανέστη.
There we go. Okay. So before we begin tonight, and Nico, you'll let me know if you guys have covered this already. I wanted to take just a few minutes to introduce you to a new book which has just come out, hot off the press virtually, but a very, very important work that I think it's worth all of you to spend some time looking at if you get the opportunity. And the book I'm talking about is this. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
The Departure of the Soul According to the Teaching of the Orthodox Church. Did Father Matthew or Father Peter talk about this at all?
No, not to my.
Okay. All right. We'll just briefly mention it. This book, in many ways, you'll see how thick it is. It's a monumental work put out by St. Anthony's Greek Orthodox Monastery in Arizona. And basically, its task is to present the unified tradition of the Holy Fathers and Mothers of our Church on the departure of the soul, basically the time before death, the time during death, and the time immediately after death. And so this book, because there has been some controversy throughout recent years, very recent years, with respect to these matters, St. Anthony's has taken it upon themselves to sort of put together a book which demonstrates just how completely unified the tradition of the Fathers is on these particular matters. And so you'll find it very much worth your while, I think, to pick up and take a read through. You'll see that in addition to the just voluminous amount of material from the Holy Fathers describing this important element of life, you'll also find, in addition to these texts, endorsements by a large number of hierarchs in North America, sort of asserting very clearly how dogmatically sound and orthodox the book and its contents indeed are. So for those of you that have interest in what is, a really important matter, because the way we understand death certainly shapes the way that we live our lives. For those of you that are particularly interested in this matter, I strongly recommend that you go out somewhere and pick up this book and take a breeze through it, because there's lots of soul profiting material in it. So we'll leave that aside for now. In contrast to what I've typically done with you guys over the past several years, typically what I've done is try to present a lecture where I sort of have sat down and prepared some notes in order to give you almost a liturgical homily, we might say, or something that resembles a liturgical homily or classroom lecture on a particular topic. What I decided I would try to do this year is present something which is a little more engaging. And so that will sort of demand of me that I try to be more interactive with you. And conversely, it'll also demand that you and your charity and your kalosini pay close attention to what I'm trying to say and respond and think through it and talk back to me when I try to ask questions. So we're going to try to have a bit of more of a back and forth environment as we go forward from this point on. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, Nico. Similar, though, to what we've done in the past, we're going to spend some time focusing on the gospel readings for the Sundays as they fall throughout the church year. And particularly, we're going to focus on how these gospel passages are interpreted by our Father among the Saints, Cyril of Alexandria. Now, this happens to be precisely what I'm also doing with my parish and my liturgical homilies. But I've found that in reading St. Cyril in order to prepare for my homilies on the Sundays, there's a wealth of material there that's indeed very beneficial for our souls. And so I've decided to do the same thing there. Now, before we move on and begin looking at what St. Cyril has about the gospel for this coming Sunday, I want to take a few minutes with you guys and just run over the life of St. Cyril. Because it's important that we see when we approach holy teachings, there are holy lives behind these holy teachings that give weight to what the saints say and what the saints tell us. And so in order to help us be convinced of the authority with which these saints speak, it's very important that we take an opportunity when we can to look at their lives and come to know them a little bit. and also so that we can, in knowing them, hopefully pray to them and have their blessing as we interact together. Saint Cyril of Alexandria was born in the year 378 in Egypt, and he was the nephew of a rather notorious figure in church history. Who is this figure? Does anyone have any guesses? Nico, do you know? Whose nephew is Saint Cyril of Alexandria? Nobody? He's the nephew of Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria. And what is Theophilus notorious for? He's notorious for being the persecutor of St. John Chrysostom, the leader in the circle of people who opposed St. John Chrysostom. And so St. Cyril is the nephew of Theophilus. St. Cyril, despite the evil that Theophilus has done, one of the wonderful things that he did was pay and look after the education of his nephew Cyril, who was able to spend his entire education in the great Greek city of Alexandria in Egypt. And Alexandria has a long-standing history as a center of Christian education dating back to the time of Origen. Many holy figures passed through the Church of Alexandria and adorned it with their learning. And so St. Cyril was able to partake of this tradition, and in his learning, at least, he spent it in this holy environment. After he finished his education, he lived 5 years in the famous Mount Nitria, which is a monastic place, living in asceticism. And there are even stories, the Synaxarion tells us, in the Evergentinos. Everyone knows what the Evergentinos is, right? Collection of stories about soul-edifying stories taken from the patristic tradition and the lives of the saints. There are stories in the Evergentinos which speak of an Abba Cyril. And the Synaxarion tells us that these are stories about St. Cyril of Alexandria before he was patriarch, during the time that he lived at Mount Nitria. His holiness was very quickly recognized within the context of this environment in his monastic life, but then also when he left the monastic life in order to begin, or left anyway, Mount Nitria, in order to serve publicly in the Church of Alexandria. His holiness was recognized very quickly, and he was promoted through the ranks of the clergy until he finally reached the Patriarchate in 412. So he became Patriarch of Alexandria in 412. Among the many important events associated with the life of St. Cyril, probably one that we should mention, at least in passing, is what happens between him and the philosopher Hypatia. Hypatia was a woman philosopher, very well known, very well respected within the community, the scholarly community in Alexandria. And she was even what we might call, I guess, to use Dante's language, a virtuous pagan. She was a peacemaker. And one of the things that she did, there was a conflict at one point between St. Cyril and the prefect Orestes, and Hypatia, the philosopher, was the one that sort of brokered between the two in order to bring about a reconciliation. However, because there were a lot of seditions and people were very rebellious in the city, people weren't very happy that these two were reconciled by Hypatia, and a crowd sort of beset her and murdered her in the street. Now, this is historically what happened. This is what the historians tell us, the Sozomenos and people like that, the church historians tell us this is how things went down. However, if any of you are familiar, there was a movie that came out a few years ago called Agora. And this movie takes this well-known historical event and twists it to become anti-Christian. What they try to say is that St. Cyril, as a Christian, was de facto against learning. So he hated Hypatia, and he incited the crowds to murder her. So it's very important that if we've been influenced by this movie in any way, that we put aside that view of St. Cyril, which is entirely not only apart from our traditional view of him, but also apart from all of the historians up to through that whole period of history. So his interactions with Hypatia are nothing like those that were portrayed in the film. But what is he known most for? If I'm to say the name St. Cyril of Alexandria, what is St. Cyril most known for? Does anyone have any guesses? Is there anything you could hazard about him that you've heard either in the hymns or in Synaxaria or lives or anything like that? What is St. Cyril most known for? No guesses. Okay, we'll keep going. St. Cyril is most known for, and best known for, and honored in fact for, is his battle with the heresy of Nestorianism, which was the teaching of the Patriarch of Constantinople, Nestorius. Now, what did Nestorius teach? Simply, Nestorius taught that it was below the dignity of God to endure the process of being given birth to. So he said there's no way God can be said to be given birth to. God, it's below God's dignity to endure that. I'll take the incarnation, I'll take all these other, I'll take that he lived afterwards in the person of Christ, but I can't take that he went through birth. And so Nestorius started to teach that in somehow the divinity was absent from this process during this period of time. It didn't partake of this as it happened. And as a consequence, he rejected the famous title of the Theotokos, the proper title of the Mother of God, the Theotokos. He wouldn't call her God-bearer because he didn't believe the divinity participated in the birth. Instead, he preferred the term Christotokos. She bore Christ, but the divinity didn't participate in the birth. And so faced with this complete blasphemy, because we of course know that in the incarnation, the divine and human natures were united without confusion in Christ. And so we rightly say Theotokos. Faced with this blasphemy of Nestorius, Cyril defended the unity of the two natures, that they stayed together, and he insisted on the title Theotokos for her. He then, of course, tried to correct Nestorius several times and with great fervor, but he couldn't. Nestorius was unwilling to understand. He refused to hear the voice of the church, and particularly the voice of St. Cyril on the issue. And all this consequently led to the Third Ecumenical Council convened in Ephesus, which was led, the shining light of the council was St. Cyril, and at this council the heresies of Nestorius were condemned. Now, another really interesting story and useful story from the life of St. Cyril is the fact that under the influence of his uncle, you remember we said his uncle was Theophilus, who persecuted St. John Chrysostom, one of the ones who worked behind the scenes to have St. John Chrysostom exiled. Under the influence of his uncle, St. Cyril bore a bit of a grudge against St. John Chrysostom. So at one point in St. Cyril's life, after St. Chrysostom had reposed, he was granted a vision of paradise. And as he entered into this vision, first he was greeted with a chorus of saints from the Old Testament and New Testament, so the prophets and the apostles. He saw them all. And then behind them, he saw a large church from which he heard beautiful chanting. And so naturally, he was attracted to this. And so in his vision, he moves through the crowd of the saints into the temple. And there he sees the Theotokos enthroned. And because of his great love for her, which is manifested in his defense of the title Theotokos, he wanted to go over and venerate her. However, as he approaches the throne to venerate the Theotokos, St. John Chrysostom steps out from the side and prevents him, and eventually escorts him outside of the church and leaves him outside. And he goes back in to be together with the Theotokos. As he's outside, though, mourning the fact that he's been kicked out of the church, he hears the Theotokos pleading with St. John Chrysostom, please allow him to come forward and venerate me for the sake of the love that he has shown me through his defense of me, as particularly with respect to the heresy of Nestorianism. And so the Theotokos prevails on St. John Chrysostom to allow St. Cyril to come in. The saint goes out, the two embrace and kiss each other, and St. John Chrysostom leads him back in, where he's allowed to venerate the temple, at which point his vision ends. And so on account of this vision, St. Cyril rather, fixed his opinion about St. John Chrysostom, and he ceased to hold his bad view of St. John Chrysostom that he'd previously held. So after this, after he'd been reconciled by the Mother of God to St. Chrysostom, St. Cyril lives a little bit longer. A few other important things go on that we're not going to cover. And he ultimately reposes on the 9th of June in 446. So now, we have an idea of whose writings we're going to use as our key to access the Holy Scriptures. We're going to use St. Cyril's writings to penetrate the depth, hopefully, to some extent, to the extent that we can, the Gospel readings. And so today, we're going to start looking at the 9th chapter of the Gospel of St. John, which tells us or recounts rather, the event of the healing of the man born blind. Pretty familiar to us all. But what we'll do is go through it piece by piece, and then I'll try to offer you a few comments from St. Cyril that show us the depth of the words that we've just read. So let's start. We'll read the first section now. So this is the first section of chapter 9 of John's Gospel. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. In the question that the apostles asked Christ, St. Cyril tells us, 2 errors are hidden. What are these 2 errors? The first error, he says, is a Greek presupposition, a philosophical presupposition, a pagan presupposition, and that is the pre-existence of the soul. What's the question they asked? Rabbi, who sinned that he was born blind? This man or his parents? Well, if the man was born blind, and he somehow sinned to cause his blindness, this means that he somehow sinned before he came to exist in the body. And so St. Cyril says the consequence of that question is the Greek understanding, the pagan understanding of the pre-existence of souls, meaning that in our belief, according to the Holy Fathers, when we're created body and soul together, simultaneously. In the Neoplatonic and the philosophical understanding, they believed that the soul was created, and that at a certain point, the soul, after having, how many ever millions of years of existence, fell into a body. So it had time to do something on its own before it fell. That's a heresy. We don't believe that. But this question presupposes that. The man is born blind. So for him to have sinned to cause his blindness, it presupposes that he existed somehow before he had a body. So that's one error. The other is an important one. It's particularly Jewish in character. And this is the notion that the father's sin, back so many generations, either first or second or third, somewhere the father's or forefathers' generation caused the son to be punished. And this Jewish understanding, St. Cyril tells us, arises from certain words of the holy prophet Moses, particularly where Moses says, remember, you all know this well, he's at one point offering a prayer to God. And he prays these words, as visiting the sins of the father upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, St. Cyril says, to draw from this the understanding that children who don't commit personal sin are punished because of the personal sins of their parents by God is a misunderstanding. And he explains why. He says the first thing that should tick us off when we hear this, when we hear someone saying that, oh, your parents sinned and you, an innocent, get punished for them, the first thing that should bother us about that is the notion that it's shameful to punish those who are not guilty. And so it should bother us to think that God would do this, because God would not visit punishment on someone who's not personally guilty. He says they misunderstand this line. Instead, Moses' prayer, he says, if we read the whole context, Moses' prayer is entirely dedicated to God's mercy. It begins this way. The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy. and he takes away transgressions and sins. That's the first part. He says, therefore, it doesn't make sense to then interpret the next line as a line about retributive punishment or justice. He gives instead a proper interpretation. Can anyone guess what he might say? Does anyone want to hazard a guess?
Making us think a lot. I'm still on the first part. That one was pretty good.
It's St. Cyril. I've told my Presbyterian many times. I love St. John Chrysostom. I loved spending the year I spent a couple of years ago going through St. John Chrysostom's Gospels. But reading St. Cyril, there's just this. I mean, St. John Chrysostom has it, but he approaches it in a different way. Maybe out of condescension, he's relating to people in a way that they can better understand. But there's a depth in St. Cyril that's absolutely flooring sometimes.
Yeah, I call it a big wow factor.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best way to put it. There's wow factor.
Big time. So again, you're asking the notion that they had that because as you're talking, think about in Greek we actually say it,
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm being challenged, which is good, to think, okay, so what? Are we wrong in that understanding?
It's particular, and we have to think there's different ways of thinking about this, but we're thinking about a particular way that St. Cyril is presenting. And he's starting from that notion of Moses, that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children unto the third and fourth generation. So, interpretively, he brings us back to the context of the passage and says, no, this prayer that Moses offered is actually an expression of mercy. So how are we going to understand this next line then, that talks about the visiting of sins under the third and fourth generation? This is what he says. I'll read you directly what St. Cyril says. I think this is the right thing. He says, suppose, pretend, think in your brain, a certain man, a transgressor of laws, having his mind full of all wickedness, and who, being taken in this manner of living, deserved to be punished without any respite. So you got a bad guy who deserves to be punished. But yet God in forbearance dealt with him patiently, not bringing upon him the wrath he had merited. So though he deserves it, he didn't get punished. Then to him who was born a son, a rival of his father in impious deeds, and outdoing his parent in villainy, God also showed long suffering towards this man. So the son is also bad, but God suffers him. But from him is born a third, and from the third a fourth, in no way inferior to their progenitors in wickedness, but practicing equal impiety together with them. Then God pours out wrath upon them, already even from the beginning deserved by the whole race, after he has tolerated as much as, and even more than behooves him, a postponement of vengeance, even unto the fourth generation. How is it not truly a commendation of divine gentleness? So he says, even if you theoretically have this situation where the children are as guilty of sin as the parents, this passage actually speaks about the fact that God forbears often the sins of multiple generations before he visits them with wrath, even if they're guilty. So this passage doesn't mean what the Jews take it to mean. It rather means it's an expression of God's forbearance even unto the third and fourth generation of sin.
So that goes back to the beginning of the prayer that you read, and that we say in Greek, makrothimos, right? The God is long suffering, right? And so, if I understood you correctly, let me just say my own head, that it shows God's mercy that even up until the 34, he still doesn't want these things to happen, but then because of lack of repentance, then it comes out. Is that how I should understand it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most important thing that St. Cyril is trying to say is this isn't an expression of a God who arbitrarily visits sins on children. It explains God's long suffering. It means something different than what we take it to mean usually. And he says if we understand it in context, we'll actually understand it as an expression of mercy and not this, if we take it by itself and just as an expression that God is retributive that God would choose to punish.
Okay, so now I'm going to reiterate. So if I understood you correctly now, more correctly, that, for example, I'll use myself. God's long suffering with me, so he the punishment that I deserve, he'll wait even if it goes to the third or fourth generation. Not that he will necessarily exact at that point in time.
Yeah, he says even if you were children, this passage means is what he's saying. This passage means that even if your children follow in your footsteps, God is so patient and long-suffering that he may wait 3 or 4 generations to see someone turn around before visiting retribution.
Gotcha.
So if we jump to it and we just read that one line, we might jump to the conclusion of God is wrathful.
Yes.
But no, this passage actually shows us how long-suffering God is. And that's what St. Cyril is trying to hammer home to us.
Father John, let me ask you this, if it's appropriate at this juncture, because we hear also from the Holy tradition that in families where there's a person who becomes a saint, that person, because of their holiness and their sacrifice and their love for God, that it could save 7 generations going back.
Or it affects.
So the effect of it, right? So like the flip side of it, correctly, the flip side of that as well, showing God's mercy, that even if he's willing to wait until the 3rd or 4th, and even then still doesn't let it happen if he sees repentance. Conversely, that if people are in the family become holy, and the effect of that going back 7 generations.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. So ultimately, what's Christ say? Christ says both of these views are wrong, right? Because that's what he says next. They ask, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Christ answers them and says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Now, in a certain sense, I think St. Cyril says that we can make a little bit too much of what Christ says in this last line, that the works of God should be revealed in him. He says, basically what this statement does at the end of this clause, its intention, is to end the line of questioning of the disciples. He wants to stop them from asking the question. He says, don't look into what's beyond you, but be reminded rather and assured only of God's love and care for generations. Don't seek into these matters too deeply. That's St. Cyril's interpretation of what he means by this. He seeks to end this line of questioning. We saw this in detail when we looked at you remember, St. Chrysostom's work on providence, when we looked a little bit at that in one of the homilies, all the arguments for not looking too deeply into the troubling things that we see. And so St. Cyril basically says that's what this is intended. When Christ says that the works of God should be revealed in him, he's actually just mainly seeking to end the questions. You ask 2 fruitless questions, I'm ending it. And so this is what he says in on page 14, if I can find it here. I want to read it to you a little bit. Yeah, he says this, St. Cyril says, to draw off the answer of the questioner in another direction and to lead us from things too deep for us to more suitable things. So his main goal is to end the line of questioning before we get ourselves into trouble speculating about what this is for. Because he says there's a certain danger in taking from this the understanding that God makes people ill just in order to glorify himself. And so he says if we dig too deeply into this line, we run the risk of making all sorts of bad interpretations of it. And so he says basically we have to understand this as a means of Christ saying, no more with this question. Now, the next line, more important stuff. He says, I must work in response to this. So remember, they've just asked these questions. Christ has basically stopped them from going further with them. And now he says, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, The night is coming when no one can work. This, St. Cyril says, is a rebuke to the apostles, and it's meant to stop them from speculating wildly, but instead that they should be careful to do God's work rather than just ask fruitless questions. And so this is what St. Cyril says. But for work and intense zeal, for I've deemed it more becoming, passing by such questions, to execute zealously God's commands, and since he has appointed us apostles to fulfill the works of the apostleship. So, yeah, the main point being there, don't ask these questions, don't dwell deeply on them, rather do the work. Do the work that you're called to do. And then he says, work while the light shines. Of course, light being salvation and grace. When I'm in the world, this line, when I'm in the world, has something of theological concern. He says, don't take this to mean that though I've ascended, I'm no longer in the world. And this is also something very useful that he says on a theological level. So he says, when I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And so some, St. Cyril says, might be tempted to take from this, well, what do you mean? Is there time when you're not in the world? And so this is how St. Cyril responds to that. And just as while he associated in the flesh with man, he was not absent from heaven. So if we think rightly, we shall hold the opinion that even though he is out of the world as regards the flesh, his divine and ineffable nature is yet no less present among those who dwell in the world.
So, Father John, forgive an insertion. So the way I'm understanding it, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that that's for us while we are alive.
Yeah.
Opportunity, Christ is in the world. Once we're done, then our time is up. Because the gospel readings are for our salvation. I think it links back to what you were saying earlier, that these foolish questions that we often get involved into, and the fathers say, divide them into two topics, meaning the questions that we ask. Topics of salvation, meaning when you die, you must answer.
Yes.
That are nice to know. Is that what he's saying here?
Well, that's what he's saying sort of earlier when he starts to talk about I must work the works. He's trying to make it more clearly that okay, on the one hand, I've stopped you from asking questions. The positive side of that is to actually be laboring in what you're called to do. So that's that's roughly. But this last point is actually sort of a theological point, in that when someone might hear him say, when I am in the world, I am the light of the world, someone might be tempted to say, well, is there a time you're not in the world? And he says, no, even before his incarnation, he was still with the world. And even now after he ascends, and his divine ineffable nature is yet no less present among those who dwell on earth. So that's more, the last point is more of a theological point, I think. Running out of places to put papers. So the basic point of that section, stop speculating and questioning wildly, but do what you're supposed to do. And then Christ holds himself up as an example, because he says that I do the works. So next section.
I was giving 2 thumbs up on that one. Can you just say that part again?
What's that?
I was giving 2 thumbs up on that one. It's a topic we've been recently discussing.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be doing.
Exactly. And then, of course, as always, Christ gives himself as the example. He doesn't call us to do anything that he's not showing us how to do himself. And so he says, I must work the works of him who sent me. So on to the next section. So this is where we start. So once he had said these things, he spat on the ground and he made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Now, St. Cyril, when he approaches the healing miracle, the first thing is he interprets it what we call allegorically. He doesn't look at it historically. He sees this event as an image of something else that's going on. And so this is particularly pertinent because if we think in the last few weeks, one of the main themes that's run through everything has been the notion of the Jewish departure from grace and the Gentiles' slow appropriation of it. This is something we've seen sort of in all of the Gospels. We see it with the Samaritan woman, for example, last week. Here, he says, the man born blind represents the pagans, the nations, the Greeks, who sit in darkness. And on account of the darkness, they weren't really able to look for Christ. At most, they could simply just grasp for him. Then he says, Christ comes to them out of an act of pure mercy and philanthropy. They receive what St. Cyril calls an unhoped for benefit. The Sabbath, the fact that this miracle takes place in the Sabbath, signifies the last age, when Christ came by virtue of his incarnation, the fullness of time. The anointing and the creation of eyes and the washing, all this, he says, symbolizes chrismation and baptism, where our nature is recreated and renewed. Now, this makes perfect sense, especially, I know with Nico at one point you're doing a lot of Father John Romanides stuff. Father John presents the tradition extremely clearly as this pertains to the understanding of the nous, that the fall of man is the darkening of the nous, so that grace can't penetrate into the soul. What is another way, how do we refer to the nous? The eye of the soul. That's another way of referring to it. So it's quite interesting that here St. Cyril speaks of the renovation of the material eye as the consequence of baptism, as part of this package that comes with the image of baptism. So now, having been washed, having been recreated, having been renewed, he can see the great light. The Gentiles can see the great light and grace and salvation. And then on top of that, he says, in contrast with the Jews who rebel and start to fight against Christ very quickly, the Gentiles run off to the pool of Siloam to do exactly what they're told. And so he says this is an image of the obedience of the Gentiles afterwards. And then later, as we're going to go a little further in this passage, we start to see that the man who's born blind after he's healed starts to teach the Pharisees in great boldness. He instructs them about what happened. And he says this is a symbol of how the Greeks would eventually become the teachers of the Jews. The Jews lost the blessing they had. The Greeks rather take up the mantle, and they in turn become the teachers of the entire world, and especially of these Jews who have fallen away and lost their blessing. And so this whole event, an actual historical event, St. Cyril gives one allegorical interpretation to it. He sees this depicting the salvation of the Gentiles and in a segment of the history of the world. Now, beyond this, however, though he interprets it this way, he also interprets the passage historically, meaning seeing it as an event that occurred in history. And so what does he say? He says, by creating the eye from clay, the creating of the eye from clay, because this man was born with no eyes. So in order to see, he can't just fix an eye. He has to create for this man an eye. And so he creates out of clay eyes for this man. This shows us, St. Cyril tells us, that he is the one who created us in the beginning from the dust of the earth. Christ, in many circumstances, we've seen over and over again, he heals by word alone, thereby demonstrating that he's God. God created by word in Genesis. How did he create? He creates by his word. He speaks and it happens. However, though that's important for him to demonstrate, he also finds it in other circumstances necessary to heal by means. He uses things in his healing in order to teach us other important things. And in this case, he heals with clay, which is made from dust with water mixed into it, in order to show us that he's the one who initially created man from dust. So, next section. A little bit longer section this time. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, "Is not this he who sat and begged?" Some said, "This is he." Others said, he is only like him. He said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes, and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him, because he opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. So, verse 14 in that section says, now it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened the eyes. This is a point of contention with the Pharisees. We see this over and over again. The Pharisees are upset that Christ would act on the Sabbath. But St. Cyril starts to explain the nature of this upset that arises amongst the Pharisees. He says, in fact, it's a pretense. They're not actually that upset by his activity on the Sabbath. There's something behind that upsetness that we have to get to. He says, they were blinded in their understanding, much worse than he who had formerly been blind in the body. So the Pharisees, he says, are more blind in understanding than the man was blind in body before this. But how do we know that what they're doing is a pretense? Because often, St. Cyril tells us, if we look through the scriptures, we see that they allow the breaking of the Sabbath for good reason. They admire, he says, for example, Joshua, who captured Jericho, I think. Joshua captures Jericho, doesn't he? Yeah. Joshua captured Jericho. Perfect. Thumbs up works well. Joshua captured Jericho on the Sabbath. They allowed something good. They had no problem with that. They, in fact, venerate it. They love it. The Levites, he says, they minister on the Sabbath. And Christ points out to them that if their ox fell into a ditch on the Sabbath, they'd go and drag the ox out. So it's not impossible for things to happen on the Sabbath. In fact, they're in support of good things happening on the Sabbath. This is something they should readily admit themselves. But St. Cyril says, seeing someone do what is clearly a work of God on the Sabbath should have led the Pharisees to think in this manner, to be fine with it. But they were bound, he says, by their malice and their envy. They couldn't see what was obvious because they were bound by malice. Things they admitted elsewhere and had no problem admitting, they couldn't admit here because of their envy. Now, that they're upset over the breaking of the Sabbath was a pretense is also shown by the next lines. So let's read these together. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received sight. And they asked them, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Now, how does this passage, these few lines, prove to us that the Pharisees' upset over the Sabbath was a pretense? Their concern, their deep concern for the law was a pretense. The law, St. Cyril says explicitly, very clearly, that the testimony of 2 or 3 is supposed to suffice for the truth of a matter. 2 or 3. Here, however, the Pharisees refused to believe the miracle on the testimony of a myriad of people. Neighbors, people that saw him sitting by the gate, all this stuff. There were a myriad of people that brought him to the Pharisees. On top of that, they don't accept 2 or 3 or 1,000. What do? St. Cyril says they go to get his parents. That shows that they're violators of the law. If they had deep respect for the law, they wouldn't violate the law. And here we see them in the next line. After they've decried the violation of the Sabbath, they go out and violate the law themselves. So let's just read a little bit what St. Cyril himself says about this. It's a little hard, St. Cyril, I understand the language is a little bit difficult in places. And it's also very difficult for me to read because it's very small type. But it's worthwhile, occasionally, I think, for us to hear the actual words of the saints. Father Theodore used to do this all the time. He'd read passages and he'd say, now I know you're not going to get this line for line, but these words are full of grace. When I give you a talk, when I talk about something the Father say, it's Father John talking about what St. Cyril says. There's something to be said for sometimes hearing, even if they're difficult, the words the saints themselves wrote. And so this is what St. Cyril says, if I can find it. Bear with me. He says, they set aside the testimony, not merely of 2 or 3, but probably many more, and go for further evidence to the parents of him who is healed, thus acting contrary to the law as well as to good manners. But the law is nothing to them when they are eager to accomplish something agreeable to their private pleasures. They don't care about the law. The law for them is just a means of getting the recognition they want. And this shows it. The fact that they're able to invoke the law in one instance when they probably normally wouldn't even invoke it, but give them the benefit of the doubt, they invoke it, then they break it. I love that last line. But the law is nothing to them when they are eager to accomplish something agreeable to their private pleasures. And that instance proves it. So the real issue at the bottom of all this, St. Cyril says, is envy. And he has a beautiful definition of envy in his work that I want to read to you. I'm doing a little more reading than I intended, but I think it's good for us. So this is what he says about envy. And I think when we read this and hear these words, I think it's important for us to reflect on our own lives, because when a lot of us are uneasy with admitting it, a lot of us experience these kinds of feelings. And so it's important for us to be able to identify them when they creep up within our soul, or we feel them creep up. This is how St. Cyril, however, defines envy. And having been taken captive, as it were, in the bonds of envy, they cannot endure to listen at all to any word that honors Christ. They cannot endure to listen to any word that honors Christ and not them, in other words. Cannot endure it. That's envy.
Well,
Go ahead,
you said that's the vainglory then?
No, that envy.
No, but for them, meaning their motivation of their envy is
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yes, it's also their vainglory. They want the position, and Christ threatens them. But envy is when we can't endure the idea of anyone having anything good. Having been taken captive, as it were, by the bonds of envy, they cannot endure to listen at all to any word that honors Christ. That's how we know when we're envious of someone. When it grinds us to hear about something good happening to somebody else. That's envy. That's the spirit of envy at work in us. Turning away from anyone wishing to speak of his miracles as from someone most hostile to themselves. Speaking good about Christ, on the one hand, they can't endure to hear it, and it's as if someone is speaking hostile about them. That's envy. I don't like to hear it, and it's as if you're attacking me by telling me someone else has got something good. That's the spirit of envy. That's how malicious it is. But beautiful descriptions. Listen to the words of the saints. Listen to how they hit the nail on the head. That's what I like about these things. They really hit it. I'm not good at conveying it all the time, but you see how sharp they are when it comes to pinning these things down. Doctors of the soul, literally.
We've had a few heart attacks hearing this stuff. I haven't said wow, wow, wow in a very long time. So
You think, Cyril, I'm telling you, like I told you earlier, I have been floored this year reading St. Cyril of Alexandria.
Of Alexandria. Fourth century?
He reposes in the 5th.
Okay. Which text are you getting the
This is a very, very old translation. It really doesn't circulate anywhere. I got it off some old download. Someone had scanned the book. But you'll see if you look at it, the pages are extremely small.
Okay.
So it's very hard to read, and the translation is very 1800s England.
Okay.
It's not part of that series. It's not part of the Nicene Fathers series. It's one of an older version they did. And so it's I mean, beautiful, beautiful stuff, but very difficult in places. So we'll keep going or we're going to lose time. We're still okay. I've got a little bit more time. Okay. Because there's more, I mean, I'm jumping over stuff. There's like 70 pages dedicated to this gospel narrative. I'm jumping over massive swaths of material. I'm just trying to hit some of the highlights and things that stood out to me as I was doing it. So anyway, that's the definition of envy. This notion that we can't endure to hear of someone else doing something good, and it feels like an attack on us when we hear it. So the man's parents, the gospel itself tells us, were frightened because they knew to confirm Christ was to be kicked out of the synagogue. But though they sort of try to stay a bit neutral in their testimony concerning what's happened to their son, they're pretty careful if we listen to their response. They yet said something that's very, very important and very revelatory in terms of confirming and giving strength to the witness of their son, to the things their son told the Pharisees. So they say, yes, he's our son. They say, yes, he was born blind. And that's sort of as far as they're going to go because they're a little bit frightened. But then they add something that St. Cyril says is extremely important. They say what? What do they add to this? Does anyone remember?
Yeah, but how he now sees, we have no idea.
Yeah, it says those things. But then they add just one little line at the very end.
Oh, he's of age, ask him?
He is of age, ask him. St. Cyril says this is really important because he says it's as if the parents are telling the Pharisees and scribes, the view that person presented you isn't the view of a child, not someone easily confused. This person is capable of relaying what happened to them accurately. So listen to him.
Knockout punch. Like, why are you here?
Yeah, sort of. But yet being very careful what they're saying. But yeah, they deliver this knockout punch at the end. Okay, so next section. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, I now see. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." The man answered and said to them, "Why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who has been born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." Now the Pharisees, though they're getting, as Nico said, a couple knockout punches thrown at them here and there, if they're subtle enough to pay attention to it, if they're not so blinded by their malice and envy that they don't even perceive them, they're not getting softer as this time goes on, as the conversation furthers. Instead, what St. Cyril points out is they're getting more proud. What's the phrase we hear from them, start to hear from them now? We know. We know that this man is a sinner. We know that God spoke to Moses. We know. How dare you speak to us? We know. So they're getting harder and harder in their position. But St. Cyril says, you're so hard in this position. If you know that God spoke to Moses, then why don't you listen to him? If you know God spoke to Moses, why don't you listen to him? Because what does Moses say? Moses speaks reams about Christ, about the person who's standing before you. Moses foretold Christ. So if you know God spoke to Moses, then you should listen to Moses and affirm the miracle that's before your eyes. And this is the hymn. This was the hymn, I read this morning, and it struck me because it sort of ties in very well. This is one of the canons from mid-Pentecost, because we just celebrated the leave-taking of mid-Pentecost today. This is one of the canons at Matins this morning. "Even if you do not believe his words, O Jews, believe the works of the Master. Why do you deceive yourselves, ye who reject the Holy One, of whom Moses wrote in the law?" Moses wrote about him. Why do you affirm Moses? Why don't you affirm all that Moses wrote and accept Christ? The other thing that's very important to note in passing on this is this notion that they bring up of knowing not from where Christ came. He says this is one that St. Cyril says this is one of the classic examples of people prophesying despite themselves. Why do you think, can anyone think of a reason why it would be prophetic to say we know not from whence he came?
I'll take a stab, because don't we say, hopefully I don't butcher this, that it was prophesied that, like Melchizedek, right?
Yeah.
Didn't know, like, I'm thinking in Greek, trying to translate into English. Without a father, having a mother, and having a father without having a mother.
Yeah, exactly. You're getting to it. That's exactly what we're talking about. It's a prophecy concerning the virgin birth, a strange birth. He said it's a bit funny for them to say something like that, because they all knew before that he was, from Nazareth.
Yeah.
They knew he was Joseph. Is this not Joseph's son? For them to say this is a bit of an odd thing, St. Cyril says. And so this is an example of them prophesying despite themselves. We know not from whence he came. It's as if they're alluding to the fact that they don't, he was born in a manner no one can understand. So, then we move on a little bit again. Actually, yeah, no, we'll leave that because we're running out of time. So what happens here? Basically, we see them asking over and over and over and over again the same questions. If we were to read all that section again, we'd be a little bit bored. Why? Because they just ask the same thing over and over and over again from slightly different angles each time. And St. Cyril says, okay, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they hope that if they ask the question enough times, he's eventually going to slip up and say something that they can capitalize on. And so they keep asking the same types of questions over and over and over again. It's a bit of a lesson sometimes for real life too. We have to be very careful that there's not other motives behind why we're asking questions. Sometimes we ask the same questions, especially with spiritual fathers. We get this sometimes. We sometimes will go to 2 or 3 different spiritual fathers asking the same question. We have to be very careful that our motive behind doing that isn't just to try to get the answer we're looking for eventually. What else are we going to say here? Instead, however, of buckling under the pressure, so he's getting all these questions hammered at him, and he keeps answering very well, in fact. Instead of buckling under the pressure of the Pharisees, he instead confesses himself to be what? A disciple. Do you also want to be his disciple? Meaning, I am a disciple also. Do you want to be together with me, a disciple? So in the midst of this pressure, he confesses himself to be a disciple. Now, in light of this, St. Cyril says something beautiful about persecution and about what persecution does for the soul. And I want to read this to you because, again, it's very beautiful. Forgive me for my shuffling, but that's going to have to be the way it is for now. Okay. This is what he says about persecution. Yet this also is signified that to suffer reproach for Christ's sake is a thing delightful and most honorable. For the very means by which those who do not shrink from becoming persecutors think to vex those who love him, become through the though the persecutors know it not, sources of joy to them. So the people who persecute actually become sources of joy to the persecuted, is what he's saying. Yea, those who persecute Christians cause their excellence to shine forth more conspicuously. They make their virtue apparent and do not so easily succeed in causing them injury. So St. Cyril's trying to point out the benefit that comes from persecution. And what does persecution do in this particular case? It reveals a disciple. And that's what it does in our daily lives. It's when we're under the gun. It's when, people's eyes are looking at us, or when the flames of the passions burn most brightly against us, lap us, when they're licking us with the flames. That's when we show ourselves a disciple. Persecution shows us what we are. And so St. Cyril is saying we ought to be grateful to persecution because the persecutors actually do a benefit to those whom they persecute because they reveal this character in them. Now, from there on in, he begins to talk about the uniqueness of Christ's miracle. So in verse 32, he says, "Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who is born blind." And so here what St. Cyril says is we're starting to get the slow perfection of this man's faith. At first, he sort of speaks to him as his physician and healer, then as a prophet. Now he's starting to cite the uniqueness of what he did for him. He's progressing under the olive press. He's becoming more perfect in his confession of Christ. And now, at the very end, the last segment, this is what we say. They answered and said to him, "You are completely born in sins." St. Cyril points out that's showing that they believe the Jewish doctrine that though your father sins, you're a victim of sin. This notion that you are completely born in sins, meaning your father sinned, your father is a sinner, therefore you were born blind. So St. Cyril says this is showing that they believe this doctrine that the apostles were rebuked for holding earlier. There we go. I lost myself. They answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us." And they cast him out. So they throw him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And he answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking to you." And then he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And that's the end of the passage we'll read on Sunday. Now, the fact that the Jews become so upset enough to throw him out show that their motive in this whole thing was not truth. And so St. Cyril writes something about this. Hard of acceptation to most people are the wounds of refutation. We saw a good example of how one properly handles refutation in the Samaritan woman. The Samaritan woman is refuted, and as a result of her acceptance of the refutation, she's given the gift of faith and salvation. However, the opposite can happen. Hard of acceptation to most people are the wounds of refutation and the consequent correction of error. They are certainly welcome and sweet to the wise, since they convey much profit and have an improving tendency, although they may carry with them a painful sting. But to those who love sin, they are bitter. And wherefore? Because having fixed their mind on debasing pleasures, they turn away from any warning that draws them thence as vexatious, and deem it a loss to be diverted from their pleasures, setting no value on what is truly profitable. So the wise man, he's saying, accepts rebuke and profits from it. The passionate man, however, gets upset by rebuke and rejects the opportunity to be improved because he's so focused. And so he said, focused on his own desires and pleasures. And so St. Cyril says this is why the Pharisees get into a rage and throw him out at the end. Because this just demonstrates they have no concern for truth whatsoever. They're enraged by having been rebuked, and they're enraged at their plan and their ideas having been sort of foiled. Then at the very end, he says something. We'll do two of them, because there's two things that are very beautiful that I just want to mention. The one, he says, is where Christ, how does Christ address him about his belief, or about who he is? He asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And he answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." St. Cyril makes a great deal about this and goes on for a long sort of passage. Why? Why would it be so important to say, "You have seen him"? Because it's an affirmation of the incarnation. Christ deliberately says something that shows he's authentically God incarnate and not just a spirit. And so he makes a big deal about that. But the other thing that St. Cyril points out that's very, very beautiful, I think, is Christ's reaction to the man's being cast out. This is what St. Cyril writes about his being cast out. The inspired evangelist says that our Lord Jesus Christ heard, not implying certainly or of necessity that anyone reported the fact to him, but because, as one of the wise somewhere says, the Spirit of the Lord fills the whole world. So he heard it. Why? He heard it because he says he heard it because he was God, not because it was reported. When therefore we suffer insult on his account, this is the very nice part, or endure any grievous thing from those who are wont to fight against God, we are bound to believe that most assuredly God is a looker on and listens, as it were, to the trial that comes upon us. For the very nature of the occurrence and the sincerity of those who are dishonored on his account cry aloud into his divine ears. So when do we bring God closest to us? When does God hear us? when we suffer persecution and wrongs humbly. And so when does Christ draw near to this man? In the hour that he's persecuted. That's when he comes to him and gives and perfects his faith. That's when he tells him, I'm the one, after he's done this. Very beautiful. So that's all I'm going to say. I've gone on more than I intended tonight. I added a few other things I was going to cut out. We don't have a lot of time for discussion or comments, but we can take a few minutes if you want to.
Is it on?
You can hear me, right?
No. That's it.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. A little louder if you can.
Okay, no problem. You mentioned that God created our souls. One thing
Yes.
I remember hearing about a saint, I think it's Saint Nicholas, and he, as an infant, would not take milk from his mother on Wednesdays.
Yes.
Which means that's a sign of holiness. And then most of us were not like that. So does that mean
Right.
people holy and other people not holy? How does that work?
Sorry, I missed the last piece to that.
I'm just wondering if, since God created our souls, does that mean he creates some people holy and other people not holy? I don't understand.
Well, I think more the way we're supposed to understand that is that that's an indication of Saint Nicholas's future holiness. At that point, he's still an infant, and as Saint Nicodemus, when he describes infancy, we're very much at the behest of our nature and our parents. So it's not that the actions aren't sort of inherently holy at that stage of his existence. They are what he's the nature he's gifted with. Just as some children are gifted with very easy natures, and other children are we're gifted with children who have very difficult natures. Sometimes it isn't blameworthy or praiseworthy necessarily in the child. But I think in cases like St. Nicholas, there's also cases in, St. Ambrose, some sort of miraculous things happen around his infancy and things. It's more of an indication, I think, of their future holiness than I don't know how we'd say it, sort of a predetermined holiness or something.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
That's good. Thank you.
Well, Father, it's a quickie. A question you mentioned earlier about persecution to be beneficial. So, can you differentiate between true persecution and fake persecution?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I don't exactly know how I would approach it. I guess a way I would view fake persecution is the temptation that sometimes causes us to bring persecution on ourselves or to see ourselves as persecuted. And this can happen. It can happen, I think, pretty easily. But I think generally, to know the difference between the two, I think it's one of the situations where I think we know the tree by its fruits. I've seen people that have, endured real persecution, and I've seen the kind of effect that leaves on their soul in terms of they grow spiritually as a result. They become giants in some cases. When someone has made themselves persecuted, usually I would presume that to be accompanied by things like bitterness, anger, judgmentalism, things like that. So I think I would try to distinguish it more along those lines. To say that there's a version of sort of self-imposed persecution, or the view that I am the one who's oppressed. And I mean, look, in all honesty too, I'll tell you, I don't think I'm scandalizing anyone. Sometimes I have to think through some things very carefully, because you can end up basically thinking of yourself as a martyr. And if you're not really careful how you deal with situations, I guess from my own experience anyway, what I see is when I do that, or when I've noticed that I've been doing that, I feel those types of bitter and judgmental feelings towards the people that I see. So I guess that's more from my experience personally than from any even patristic things. I just see that's how it's happened when I've done it wrongly. Conversely, though, I have had in my life examples of very good people who have suffered persecution, and the spiritual heights they've emerged from that persecution with are astounding. And so I think that's how we have to see, if we see that we're going on the wrong path with it, if those passions are erupting in us. I mean, look at the example of someone like Saint Nectarius, for example. I mean, Saint Nectarius emerges with love and all of these things, and he weeps at times, but he weeps because he just doesn't understand why people bear those things. But he doesn't hate them. He doesn't, it doesn't not love them. He loves them and can't understand why they do these types of things. But there's no malice or anything in that. And so, in the wrong type, when we make ourselves a martyr, I think we look. There's also this reality too. The fact is, when we suffer martyrdom, there's a quote unquote martyrdom, persecution, there's grace that comes with that. When we make ourselves a martyr, there's no grace in doing that. And so we're left with nothing but the exposure of our passions. And that's going to manifest itself in hatred and anger and all these types of things. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, thank you, Father. It also helps remove the chip from your shoulder before.
Well, we get the chip. That's the thing. We get the chip. We just got to do something with it when we get it.
Carve it into a cross.
Papa Nescoresi, thank you so much for sharing the St. Cyril of Alexandria. We often think about only the Nestorian heresy. Not that that's not important, but by the way, it's of course extremely important. But his explanation of this gospel reading, brought more than one wows, but also comparison back to the Samaritan woman, the exact same fruit we see there.
Yeah.
It's not. What's beautiful is oftentimes the error that I make is, okay, this is an allegory. This is a true story, but to see within the true story the depth of the spirituality for us, not just the event itself.
Yeah.
The spiritual analytics, I will call it, of it, are astounding.
Yeah, it's amazing when you see actually all three of them together. When you see the paralytic, the Samaritan woman, and this, because St. Cyril draws a lot of the threads through them all. And you'll see that, I think, if you reflect back on those other two, even though we didn't really talk about them, if you reflect back on those two gospels with some of the themes that we've raised tonight, you'll start to see why the church puts these readings all together. They raise a lot of the same types of themes.
And like the rebuke part, that part was really, really good, that if we are true seekers of the truth and want true spiritual healing, and if we're mature, spiritually mature, that the rebuke will like it.
Yeah.
Because it's correcting us. It's like, oh, okay, I'm off there. Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, it's exactly what we say in rebuke a wise man and he will become wiser.
True.
Excuse me, Father. Do you know the date or the translator or the title of the book?
Let's see. I did have it somewhere at one time. I think it's I don't remember. I think it's 1848. And it's Pusey, but it's not Edmund. It's not Edmund Pusey. It's his nephew or something. It's like P.E. Pusey instead of E.B. Pusey, the lesser known of the Puseys. But I can send it to Nico if I'll find it and send it to Nico, and he can give it to you.
Or company knows find really good old books dirt cheap. So I think he's going to go on a scavenger hunt. Holy scavenger hunt.
There's dirt in
Well, see, the good thing is a lot of these old Anglican translations, number one, they were generally fairly accurate because they didn't really have an agenda. You have to worry a little bit about the Roman Catholic ones because the Catholic ones had, for example, consonant with their dogma, if they encounter a part that actually speaks against something a pope has said, they by right are supposed to change it or delete it. So, for example, if you buy copies of the Summa Theologica, the great work of Thomas Aquinas, in the official copies, large sections are blacked out because they were not in the official. They weren't in consonant with the official teaching of the Catholic Church. And so the same thing has to happen a little bit with their patristic translations. They end up having to alter them or just remove parts.
Brooke was asking the title of the book.
What was it called? I think it was just Commentary on the Gospel According to St. John, but I'll look it up and send it to you exactly so you have it.
Cyril, right? Saint Cyril.
Cyril, yes, Cyril of Alexandria.
Saint Cyril. Oh,
If you type into the internet, if you put Cyril of Alexandria, Gospel of St. John, it will come up.
Okay.
They do. Oh, you know what they did do, Procopio? I mean, I don't know if anyone wants this, but they did do a new edition of it. I think just like a reprint of the old version. And I've seen that around too. That was done in like 2013 or something.
Thank you again.
But it's like 20. You know, this one you find it at a good used bookstore. You might be able to get it for like $6 or something a volume. That one's going to be like 30 some bucks a volume.
Thank you so much, Papa. Thank you. If we could ask for your closing prayers.
O Christ, the true light which illumines and sanctifies every man who comes into the world, let the light of thy countenance be signed upon us, that in it we may behold the light unapproachable, guide our footsteps aright to the keeping of thy commandments, through the intercessions of thine all immaculate mother and of all thy saints. Amen. Christos Anesti.
That was awesome. Simply